Jesus in the White House introduction. The United States has long proclaimed itself a nation under God. From the earliest days of the Republic, American leaders have invoked divine providence to justify wars, economic expansion, and political ambition. Yet in recent decades, the figure of Jesus Christ has taken on a more direct, instrumental role in political life. No longer simply a religious figure worshipped by millions, Jesus has become a campaign prop, a cultural brand, and a symbol wielded. In the corridors of power, this essay explores the phenomenon of Jesus in the White House, a shorthand for how American politicians, particularly presidents and presidential hopefuls, have invoked Jesus for political and economic gain. By examining history, campaign rhetoric, media strategies, and the consequences of this exploitation, we can better understand how the image of Jesus has been reshaped to serve partisan ends, often at odds with his actual teachings. The historical foundation's early invocations of God in politics, founding documents emphasize religious freedom, but they also reflect a deep cultural religiosity. The Declaration of Independence refers to nature's God and the Creator as sources of human rights. George Washington spoke of divine providence in shaping the new nation, and successive leaders continued the practice. While the early republic maintained separation of church and state in legal terms, presidents often used religious imagery to appeal to voters. Over time, references to Christianity, especially the figure of Jesus, became increasingly common. The rise of civil religion by the 20th century. The US had developed what sociologist Robert Bellah called civil religion, a blending of national identity with religious belief. Jesus was not always invoked explicitly, but the moral authority of Christianity underpinned political discourse. World War II and the Cold War intensified this trend, as leaders portrayed America as a Christian bulwark against atheistic communism. Dwight Eisenhower captured the spirit of the era when he declared, "Our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." For many Americans, that faith was understood to mean Christianity, with Jesus as its core. Jesus as political capital campaigns and testimonies. Modern presidential campaigns often feature personal testimonies of faith. Candidates speak of how Jesus has influenced their lives, providing both authenticity and moral authority. George W. Bush famously said during a debate in 1999 that Jesus was his favorite philosopher, a statement that solidified his bond with evangelical voters. These testimonies function like political currency. By invoking Jesus, candidates signal shared values with millions of Christian voters. In an age where identity politics matters, presenting oneself as a follower of Jesus becomes as important as party affiliation. The evangelical bloc. The rise of the evangelical voting bloc in the 1970s and 1980s turned Jesus into an electoral kingmaker. Leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson mobilized millions of believers to vote based on issues framed as moral mandates: abortion, same-sex marriage, and school prayer. Politicians who embraced Jesus-centered rhetoric found themselves rewarded at the ballot box. In effect, Jesus entered the White House not through theology, but through strategize. His name and image became indispensable tools for electoral success. Case studies: Presidents and Jesus. Jimmy Carter. The born-again President Jimmy Carter, elected in 1976, was the first president to openly describe himself as born again. His language resonated with evangelicals who felt overlooked by mainstream politics. Though Carter's policies did not always align with conservative Christian priorities, his authenticity set a precedent. A president could, and perhaps must, publicly identify with Jesus. Ronald Reagan. The evangelical Ronald Reagan perfected the use of Jesus as campaign rhetoric. Although not especially devout in private, he spoke frequently about America's divine mission and aligned himself with the moral majority. Reagan painted political conflicts in biblical terms, portraying conservatives as defenders of God's order. Evangelicals rewarded him with overwhelming support, cementing the fusion of Jesus and the Republican Party. George W. Bush. Faith as identity. George W. Bush's presidency demonstrated how Jesus could become a personal and political identity. His narrative of redemption, transforming from a wayward drinker to a leader guided by Jesus, resonated deeply with voters. His policies on education, stem cell research, and foreign affairs were often framed in moral and religious language. Bush's reference to the war on terror as a crusade and his conviction that freedom was God's gift to humanity revealed how religious language shaped not only campaigns, but also policy. Barack Obama. Balancing faith and pluralism. Barack Obama invoked Jesus differently. As a member of the United Church of Christ, he emphasized compassion, justice, and community themes rooted in the Gospels. Yet he also sought to balance this with America's religious diversity, often affirming Muslims, Jews, atheists, and others. Critics accused him of being insufficiently Christian, or even of hiding his true religion. This revealed the political risks of invoking Jesus too cautiously. In the White House, Jesus was not just a symbol of faith, but a litmus test for patriotism. Donald Trump. Jesus as a brand. Perhaps no president illustrates the instrumental use of Jesus more than Donald Trump. Despite little evidence of personal faith, Trump cultivated evangelical support by aligning with religious leaders, appointing conservative judges, and staging religious symbolism. His infamous photo op outside St. John's Church in Washington, D.C., holding a Bible after protesters had been cleared by force, epitomized the use of Jesus as campaign theater. Evangelical leaders compared Trump to biblical figures like King Cyrus, imperfect, yet chosen by God to fulfill divine purposes. For Trump, Jesus was not a guide for policy, but a brand that secured loyalty. Under his leadership, Jesus in the White House became a partisan slogan rather than a moral compass. Economic dimensions of Jesus in politics, fundraising, and religious networks. Religion provides not only votes, but also money. Churches, televangelists, and faith-based organizations raise billions annually, much of which is funneled into political advocacy. Politicians gain access to vast donor networks by aligning with Christian causes and invoking Jesus. The prosperity gospel movement further amplifies this dynamic. By teaching that faith leads to wealth, prosperity preachers encourage donations to both churches and political campaigns, framing giving as a form of spiritual investment. Jesus becomes a guarantor of economic gain both for individuals and for candidates. Consumerism and religious branding. Political campaigns borrow from religious branding to sell candidates like products. Slogans, imagery, and rallies mimic revival. Meetings, complete with references to Jesus as a source of inspiration. Merchandise. Buttons, t-shirts, mugs often features both patriotic and Christian symbols. In this context, Jesus is commodified. His name printed alongside campaign slogans as if he were an endorsement logo. Jesus and policy making. When Jesus enters the White House rhetorically, he often shapes policy debates. Abortion. Politicians cite Jesus as defender of the unborn, shaping. Restrictive laws. Immigration. Some invoke Jesus' command to welcome strangers, while others use him to defend national security, economic policy. Jesus is sometimes portrayed as champion of free enterprise through prosperity preaching, and sometimes as advocate for the poor. Foreign policy. Wars are framed in moral and religious terms, with opponents demonized as ungodly or evil. These applications rarely reflect the complexity of Jesus' teachings. Instead, they distill him into simple slogans that legitimize pre-existing agendas. Media and the religious political complex. The media plays a crucial role in keeping Jesus in the White House. Christian broadcasters, podcasts, and online platforms deliver both sermons and partisan commentary. Figures like Pat Robertson and Franklin Graham blur lines between preaching and campaigning. Cable news amplifies religious divides, portraying elections as battles for the soul of America. Social media memes reduce Jesus to hashtags and slogans. This religious political complex ensures that Jesus remains a permanent fixture in American politics, accessible, marketable, and endlessly usable. The dangers of politicizing Jesus. Distortion of faith. When politicians use Jesus for gain, his teachings are cherry-picked to support partisan goals. His call to serve the poor, forgive enemies, and reject wealth is often ignored. Instead, he is recast as a nationalist, capitalist, or culture warrior. Polarization. Jesus, as political slogan, divides rather than unites. Opponents are demonized not just as wrong, but as anti-Jesus. This fosters hostility, undermining democracy's need for compromise. Disillusionment. Younger Americans, witnessing this exploitation, often leave churches in frustration. They see faith as corrupted by politics, accelerating trends of secularization, threats to democracy when Jesus is treated as a partisan ally. Separation of church and state erodes. Policies risk being justified not by evidence or debate, but by claims of divine authority. Alternatives. Reclaiming Jesus beyond politics. Not all Christians. All Christians accept the politicization of Jesus. Many emphasize his universal message of love, justice, and humility. Progressive Christian movements focus on economic justice, racial reconciliation, and environmental stewardship, resisting the reduction of faith to partisan identity. Some pastors remind congregations that Jesus rejected political power, declaring, "My kingdom is not of this world." For them, invoking Jesus in the White House is not faithfulness, but distortion. Conclusion. Jesus in the White House is not about theology, but about power. From Jimmy Carter's testimony to Donald Trump's photo op, presidents have used Jesus as a campaign tool, a fundraising symbol, and a source of legitimacy. His name has been invoked to pass laws, wage wars, and mobilize voters, yet the cost is profound. Christianity risks losing credibility, reduced to a partisan slogan. Democracy suffers when politics becomes a contest of divine claims rather than rational debate. And the true message of Jesus, love, justice, humility, sacrifice is overshadowed by noise. The challenge for America is not to banish Jesus from public life, but to resist exploiting him as a political brand. If his voice is to matter, it must transcend parties, campaigns, and slogans, calling the nation not to division but to compassion, not to self-interest but to service. In the end, the question is not whether Jesus belongs in the White House. The question is whether he belongs in campaign speeches, fundraising appeals, and partisan battles, or whether his teachings call Americans to a higher, more authentic vision of justice and love.